Marine Le Pen's far-right National Rally Party wins the first round of France's parliamentary elections. What does that mean for the country and beyond? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. They were once viewed as a fringe movement, but after winning a third of the vote in the first round of France's parliamentary elections, Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party may now become the first far-right party to enter the French government since World War II. That will depend on results from next Sunday's second round. We begin with this report from Will Denselow.
All smiles for National Rally supporters and its long-standing figurehead, Marine Le Pen. The opinion polls largely rang true. The RN won big in the first round of voting. But its leader, Jordan Bardella, cautioned against complacency. He's eyeing an absolute majority and a shot to be Prime Minister when French citizens head back to the polls in the runoff race on July 7th.
J'appelle donc ce soir.
I therefore call on all French people who care about their freedom and France's recovery to join me in amplifying the momentum and ensuring that the national union wins out against those who want to divide us, undermine public order and trample on our values.
Et bafouer nos valeurs.
The RN's opponents say those values are of division and discrimination. Exit polls from Sunday's race triggered some protests on the streets of Paris. The electorate is waking up to the prospect of the first French far-right government since World War II.
I'm a little surprised because I wasn't expecting this result. It's unprecedented for France.
I'm a little pessimistic for France's future regarding the election's outcome.
The elections are the result of anger towards the president, who lacks understanding of the French people's daily struggles.
Analysts say this election was an enormous gamble, just 3 weeks after President Emmanuel Macron's centrist Bloc suffered a bruising result in European elections. France wasn't due to hold elections until 2027. The RN's opponents say voters can still prevent them from securing an absolute majority in the National Assembly.
So the situation is clear. The challenge of the second round is to deprive the extreme right of an absolute majority by building an assembly where we will carry enough weight to build majorities based on projects and ideas between Republican forces.
Members of both the centrist Bloc and the left-wing New Popular Front coalition have suggested they'll withdraw candidates tactically in an effort to beat the RN in runoff races. The National Rally's already made historic gains in this election. It's a gut punch to Macron's centrist alliance. But now they're seeking an absolute majority in Parliament and a knockout blow. William Denselow, CGTN, Paris.
Okay, let's break it all down. Let's get to our panel. Yves Sintomer is a political science professor at Paris Wit University and an associate at the University of Oxford's Nuffield College. Klaus Larres is a history and international affairs professor with the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Also with us is Richard Worley. He's the international correspondent for Blick, a Swiss daily newspaper. And Joav Toker is an associate professor at the American Graduate School in Paris. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Joav Toker, let me start with you and get your assessment, your brief assessment of what took place over the weekend in France. The National Rally was once seen as a fringe movement, as I said. I mean, now it is, as the Prime Minister said, at the gates of power. They got 33% of the vote in the first round. What are your thoughts?
Well, it used to be a fringe political power, that's true, but that's over 40 years ago. And since the early 80s, we have little by little, grade by grade, with very few exceptions, more and more formal power attached to this party. At the beginning, it was Marine Le Pen's father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, who was leading the party. And since about 15 years, 12, 15 years, it is his daughter who's leading the party and has pretty much succeeded what the French called banalisation of the party, which makes it almost like a so-called normal party. That has worked, and worked beautifully in terms of electoral efficiency. What we're going to see over the coming 7 days with the runoff taking place this coming Sunday is for sure the National Rally, Le Pen's party, becoming the most powerful political group in French parliament. This will already be a huge precedent. Will they have the absolute majority which will actually force imposed on President Macron to call upon the leader, Mr. Bardella, to form a government and become the executive or part of the executive power in France is not clear. They may be the largest, most powerful party ahead, away from absolute majority, which enables it to rule. So we're going to have an unprecedented situation, but we don't know what comes right after we find out which way the French actually vote.
Okay. Richard Worley, great to have you with us. The results reveal that France is now a deeply fractured country politically. I mean, if the National Rally gets its way, gets a majority, absolute majority in the runoff, which takes place on Sunday, then President Macron will be forced really to appoint a prime minister from within its ranks. But the question is, what drove so many of the French voters to the right?
Well, I guess the first reason is general discontent and the fact that President Macron himself is very unpopular at the moment. And he's been unpopular since the Yellow Vest crisis 5 years ago. He has never managed to kind of claim back since this social crisis. I believe the second reason is the discontent a lot of French voters do have with Europe. One of the characteristics of the National Front, the National Rally as they call themselves now, is that they are a strongly sovereignist party, anti-European, though they are trying now to soft down their tone on the European Union, but they use to claim for Frexit, the withdrawal from the European Union, and they use to defend the possibility of France leaving the euro. So you see, I think that discontent plays a role. And finally, we have to recognize that the very young leader, 28 years old Jordan Bardella, managed to cap the attention of the youth. He is very popular with the youth, and some observers and experts now call him the TikTok candidate, and he's been very active on social media. So you have discontent, anger, frustration with the European Union, immigration, security, and the charisma of a very young leader.
Richard, President Macron called a snap election shortly after results were coming in from the European election, where the right did very well. I mean, would it be fair to say now that this decision by the president has backfired?
I think it's fair to say that, though we have to wait for the second round, because we may have some surprise. I personally don't think the surprise will be that big. I think the dynamic, I think the wind is blowing clearly in favor of the National Rally, but it's possible that at the end, if the National Rally doesn't win absolute majority, President Macron may be left with some room of maneuver. Well, let's say that he has played poker and he has lost. But I'd like to say also that it was a democratic gesture. President Macron wanted to go back to the people, and I think we should salute them. He decided to go back to the people, to give them a voice, and what came when they vote was not what he expected.
Yves Sintomer, whatever the final tally, I mean, how big a political realignment are we going to see in the French legislature, in the National Assembly?
Very difficult to say, because it depends much on the result of the vote on Sunday. If there had been no tactical alliance between the center-right of President Macron and the left, then the scenario would have been a majority, absolute majority for the National Rally. But in half, more or less half of the 300 constituencies where there was 3 possible candidates in the second round, in half of them there were agreements between the left and the center-right, so that there remained only the candidate which is most advantage for fighting electorally the national rally. So national rally with absolute majority, then it would be a shock, a complete shock. Another scenario, which is now the most probable, is that there will be no majority in the French Assembly, and then everything is open, because we have not seen this since a lot of years. Always when there was a relative majority, it was the majority of the president, and it was possible for the president to play with this.
Right.
But with the president from the one side and a relative majority of the other side of the political spectrum, we don't know what will happen.
And Yves Sintomer, looking at the executive now, I mean, how does President Macron function with someone who would be a political adversary? I mean, I say function, it could be a recipe for dysfunction, couldn't it?
We have seen this in France with a president from the left and a prime minister from the right, or the opposite. But in these cases, with Mitterrand, Chirac and Jospin, it was different because the distance between the president and the prime minister was not that huge. In this case, the difference is huge, and it would be a recipe for a non-functional political system and government.
Klaus, we've seen far-right parties now in coalition governments in Hungary, Italy. We've seen the Belgian Prime Minister also resign after a strong showing by the right in Belgium in the European election. And in Germany, of course, we have the far-right AfD, the Alternative for Germany, which has reported a surge in membership. I mean, what's behind this rise of the far-right, which we're seeing across Europe?
Well, as my colleague said before, it is really general discontent, general frustration with the situation. The immigration situation is at the top of the ladder of discontent, and also the economic situation, inflation, all that contributes to a widespread discontent, which people have said the general established parties are not the answer anymore. They don't have that has really led to...
Go ahead, Klaus, can you hear us?
Party. Yeah, and all that discontent, which I mentioned, that has led to the rise of far-right parties all over Europe. I should say regarding France, that here we are dealing with a very far-right party. When you look at Italy, Prime Minister Meloni has actually turned out to be more moderate than anyone expected. And of course, in Germany, the very far-right AfD is not in government and far away from government. But Le Pen is actually coming very, very close to being the governing party in France. So we are looking forward to a huge situation of instability in France. The only good thing among all this is that in France we have a presidential system. So it is the President Macron, who will be in office for another 3 years. Macron will run foreign policy. He will run French national security policy. And that, of course, is something to be welcomed, that there is not suddenly a far-right prime minister which deals with France in an international way. Still, Europe, for example, is very much affected by what seems to be a looming crisis in France.
Richard Worley, the far right, or for that matter, the hard left in France, they're promising a break from Macron's pro-business agenda, and they're blaming him for the deficit as well. Jordan Bardella, we've been talking about him. He could become the Prime Minister of the National Rally, is the leading candidate right now. This is what he had to say. Let's watch this.
What I have said is, to have the agenda that I'm advocating for the country, I need an absolute majority in the French National Assembly. So either the French grant me absolute majority, or they will take the risk of seeing the new Popular Front come to power. I don't want that for France. I believe there are many French people who don't want this for France.
So we heard him say that more than once today. He wants an absolute majority. What's on his agenda, Richard?
Well, first, to win the election. That's the immediate agenda he has, because the next round is on Sunday. And as you know, it was a very short campaign because President Macron took the decision to dissolve the National Assembly right after the result of the European election on the 9th of June. So Jordan Bardella is campaigning, and he's campaigning by appealing to his voters, saying you should go to vote in large numbers because we need absolute majority, otherwise we won't be able to govern. We'll see whether this argument pays off. It may pay off. And the second argument he has is to say, if you don't choose me, then the Popular Front, which is the coalition of the left, will come into power. In reality, it's not true, because the coalition of the left at the moment doesn't have enough seats to stand as a relative majority or an absolute majority. They will have to be part of a coalition, and President Macron is very reluctant to bring the radical left in a coalition. He doesn't want that. So the danger of the left that Bardella is putting on the table is not realistic. It is by far an argument to attract his voters and to get as much vote as he can.
Joav Toker, what do your political instincts tell you about where the second round could end up after this weekend?
Well, my better intuitive sense tells me that indeed, and it's not a way of avoiding your question, both possibilities, both scenarios are possible. It is clear, as I already said, that the National Rally will be the #1 political party in the House, in Parliament. It is not clear whether they will be behind the magic figure of 289 deputies, which they need in order to have an absolute majority and actually limit the possibilities of President Macron, who remains president. He will have to call upon Bardella to form a government. But I would say that what it may mean on a larger scale is not just the punctual programmatic issues which are at stake, and this is true when we speak about the National Rally on the extreme right, as well as some parts of the Popular Front, so-called, on the extreme left. It is actually the fact that both those extreme entities on the French present political entities are anti-system elements. And this is what perhaps characterizes them in relation to other movements which we see in Europe and beyond Europe. You already mentioned Italy and Hungary, and we had the Brexit precedent on different grounds, but still of some similar characteristics. And I don't want to even cross the Atlantic and mention the Brazilian experiment or President Trump and the US political scene. So it is something which goes beyond France, perhaps beyond Europe, and is in a way counted in something which is perhaps global.
Yves Sintomer, I want to look a little bit closely at the sort of French electoral system, which gives us the kind of thing that could happen where we have a president from one party and a prime minister from another. And as we have heard, you know, the defense and foreign policy are seen as the preserve of the French president, no matter who is the prime minister. But, you know, as was also pointed out, the opposition now will, or the prime minister rather, will come from the extreme right, the far right, and the National Rally is challenging that proposition that, you know, the president handles foreign policy and defense policy. I mean, are we going to see something of a struggle ahead of us on exactly who exercises these powers?
If the National Rally gets prime minister positions, there will be a struggle. Because constitutionally, the president is responsible for foreign policy. But, for example, the foreign policy needs money to be effective. And the money is decided by the prime minister. It means that a consensus should be, a minimal consensus should be effective in order for the foreign policy to be functional. And this is not clear yet what will happen. If I may add something which is a bit different, I don't think that the left in France should be equated to a far left. To some extent, even the most radical part of the left in France, the one of Mélenchon, is not that different from, say, Sanders in the US. So you still have something which is part of the Republican consensus, and this is also why, in a number of cases, the center-right decided not to present a candidate in the second round, even if the so-called France Insoumise was in front with the National Rally.
Klaus Larres, given what the National Rally is talking about in terms of who exercises, foreign policy power and defense policy, and the fact that, they will look at having a say in this, if we look at the impact the French election could have, say, on France's allies, especially the United States, I mean, the United States has already said that whatever happens in France, whatever the outcome, the immediate impact and the other functions that France would be called upon in foreign policy, things like shared responsibilities in the G7, would be very, very limited. How do you see it?
Well, they would say that, of course. All the allies try to play down what is happening in France. Yeah. And one really has to ask oneself, why did Macron call for these snap elections in the first place? That was a highly dangerous gamble, and he knew that it could all go wrong, as it now has, and he still went ahead with it. So that turmoil and instability in France was partially created, or at least tolerated by Macron. And I think this is very difficult to understand also for France's allies in the G7. But it is, of course, correct that the president makes foreign policy. So regarding, particularly regarding French role in Europe, this will delay any impact the right-wing government has. Yeah. While the right-wing government, if it comes to it, will attack immigration laws in the European Union, they will try to dilute the Green Deal. They will also definitely drag their feet on weapons and ammunition and arms for Ukraine. That will only have a delayed consequence. But still, it is a dangerous development, and within a few months we will notice a difference. Not immediately, though.
Yeah, but Klaus, could we see a situation that we've also seen in Italy, campaigning for office and being in office, as we've seen in Italy, are two very different things. Once Giorgia Meloni got into office, she tempered much of what she was saying during the campaign.
Of course, and everyone was positively surprised about that, and it has been welcomed. We can all be surprised, and suddenly Le Pen becomes a second Meloni, suddenly because she becomes a real Democrat, suddenly she becomes not a friend of Putin anymore. Of course, that possibility is still there and cannot be totally ignored, but I wonder, she also has to a certain responsibility to her voters, and her voters expect her to govern in the way she has promised to do in her election campaign. So I would be very surprised if Le Pen suddenly became a moderate politician.
Richard Worley, I want to look at one domestic policy issue which has been getting a lot of attention, and that is Muslim French voters expressed deep concerns and reservations over the likelihood of this far-right victory. 2 years ago, Marine Le Pen said, for instance, that she wants to ban the Muslim headscarf, the hijab, completely ban that. What do you see ahead?
I see a possible confrontation in the streets. I'm quite pessimistic on what could happen in the streets of France if the National Rally takes power, has absolute majority, and form a government. The reason being that they will need some symbolic measures, because there are a lot of things that they won't be able to do, especially like what Klaus was saying, when it comes to, let's say, foreign alliance, when it comes to the European Union, because Macron is there as the savior of foreign policy, they will have to back down the National Rally on many issues. So what are they going to do is to concentrate on domestic and symbolic issues. And the number one of it is immigration. So we can expect, for example, some migrants to be sent back forcibly to their original countries, measures like that. And that would probably trigger some violence in the suburbs and in different quarters of the population. Keep in mind that France in Europe has the largest Muslim population with around 6 million people. So there is a risk of tension, and it's true also that part of the left, the very radical left, is playing that card. They have member of parliament elected in those suburbs, and they are also kind of enlightening a bit, I mean, putting a bit of fuel on the fire. So I'm a bit afraid, and if you talk with many experts of France, they would tell you that we can't completely avoid or take away the risk of social unrest, even if, and nobody has mentioned the word, we have the Olympic Games in Paris in just 3 weeks' time.
Yves Sintomer, what are your thoughts on that? You know, do you share the concerns that Richard Welly was talking about on the possibility that there could be social unrest in France?
I do agree on the fact that National Rally, if there win an absolute majority, will have difficulties to implement a lot of policies he is advocating for, and that they will have to decide symbolic and internal policies which could hurt a large number of people in France. So unrest there will be, but there is unrest and unrest. Say it's quite different when you have a general strike and a country which is paralyzed. It's another thing when you have demonstrations in the street, but peaceful demonstrations in the street. It's another story again when you have, like 5 years ago with Yellow Jackets, demonstrations in the street with a lot of struggles. And it is very difficult to know what will happen. The third scenario is quite possible.
Klaus Larres, very quickly, I've got under 30 seconds, but how will the senior officials at the European Commission in Brussels be looking at what's happening in France right now?
They will be very concerned, but they will also try to shrug it off. The new leadership team of the European Union is taking shape with Ursula von der Leyen again being the Commission president and the Estonian Prime Minister being the foreign affairs person. So it all seems to go its old traditional way. But everyone knows, of course, that under the surface, under the European political surface, things are really dramatically changing, and they have to be addressed. And hopefully the EU Commission president and her team will actually make an attempt to do so.
Okay, and that is where we'll leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.